Welcome, everyone. My name is Ariadne Moreno. I'm an associate on the Strategic Initiatives team at Catalyst Ed, supporting post-secondary programs. Catalyst Ed serves as a backbone organization for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Intermediaries for Scale IFS portfolio, which aims to reach, influence, support, and sustain improvement in post-secondary institutions nationwide to dramatically increase student success outcomes for students of color and those from low-income households. As part of our work, we support the IFS through community building and coordination and individual capability building alongside a diverse range of support partners. This past April, we helped co-create the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's post-secondary ecosystem convening titled Designing for the Future, which brought together a variety of different stakeholders from the post-secondary ecosystem for 4 jam-packed days. We asked our IFS community members what they wanted to get out of the convening, and there was a resounding call for connecting our work in higher education to broader social justice movements. And we were incredibly lucky to have Alicia Garza, American civil rights activist and writer, and co-creator of the Black Lives Matter movement, as our keynote speaker. She talked of lessons learned in community activism, coalition building, and grassroots organizing, and reflected on courage and this question around how do we transform our rage into courageous actions. And overall gave us advice for us higher education leaders in our work. So we're super excited to have Dr. Jacquelyn Jones and Dr. Dhanfu Elston joining us today to share their reflections from the keynote address. Jacquelyn Jones works as the Senior Director of ASCU's Frontier Set and Student Success Strategy for the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. Through her extensive work in higher education, she developed a passion for college access, student success, and helping colleges increase the number of graduates among minority, first generation, low income, and underserved populations. Dhanfu Elston serves as Complete College America's Chief of Staff and Senior Vice President for Strategy, where he utilizes his national policy and campus expertise for practical application, implementation, and scaling of CCA strategies at institutions throughout the United States. So thank you both for joining us today, Jackie and Dhanfu. I think we're just gonna jump right into the questions. So to start, Alicia asked us to imagine a different future and forge a new path. She invites us to be change makers and rule changers and leave behind the limited options that have been placed in front of us. What does this new future look like for you? What does this new future look like for higher education?
Sure, I can go ahead and kick us off. I think that's a great question. I would say for me as a Black woman, a new future looks like Black communities being powerful in every areas of our lives. And that's what she kind of talked about in her keynote. It's because it's something that we deserve. As Alicia Garza said in her keynote, she has worked tirelessly to build the power of Black communities and also interrupt those things that are just unacceptable. To forge this new way, to forge a new path, and then leaving behind the limitless options that have been placed before the Black community. I would say that the Black Lives Matter movement is a political and social movement. It's originating among African Americans, emphasizing basic human rights for racial equality for Black people. And it's campaigning against the various forms of racism. It is about ending white supremacy and supporting Black communities. And so the name Black Lives Matters functions as a declaration that Black people's lives have just as much value as white people's lives, and as a call to end systems and practices that challenge this fact. So for so long, Black communities have shown this country how to endure. We've shown them how to persevere, and we've shown them how to survive from strength, not just because we want to, but because we have to, just because of in spite of all of the barriers that have been placed in our paths. So a new future in higher education, for me, will have dismantled structural barriers and systemic racism that currently exists for people of color in higher education today. We know that colleges and universities are complex, and we often do not have a student-centric approach to course offerings or availability of courses for students of color, advising, and other institutional policies that oftentimes will disadvantage our students of color. And so a new future will no longer create these disparities, but the leaders will prioritize learner success and institutional change, as well as create better systems that will engage diverse change agents in institutional transformation, as well as adopt a support of as well as adopting as well as adopting institutional policies that is more of an asset-minded framework. So I think that we must build a higher education system that reflects the needs, the goals, and the aspirations, and the lived experiences for our communities of color.
I think that's a beautiful vision. Dhanfu, do you want to build upon that?
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I think that Alicia Garza's kind of keynote, her speech, her conversation, it really kind of touched me in a way that I didn't really expect. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about racial inequities and what our challenges are and how we solve these problems. But I think there was such a very kind of practical and honest component of her conversation with us that I think was needed. And I think the reality, especially in this moment when we are really talking about decentering whiteness at the forefront of higher education, when we're talking about who got left behind, and that's a hard thing to kind of wrestle with when you realize you have been doing this work for a decade, 2 decades, and to recognize that we still have significant gaps and haven't really solved some of the core problems, I think was what really resonated the most with me. I think that for me, she moved from kind of this idealistic view of what needs to happen to a how do you do it. And I think we talk about things like scale all the time. But what I really enjoyed was the focus around networking. And I think that's the direction that, the Gates Foundation and the Intermediaries for Scale organizations are moving toward. But if you are truly networking, it means something different. It means something about including voices that have not always been there. It means having some hard conversations. It means doing some inner work before you can do the outer work. And I think those things were absolutely critical to me. And I think those are the things that really kind of framed up what the work looks like in front of us.
I agree. I think she definitely made a big emphasis towards the end on this idea of coming together and in a networked way. And I like this point that you made about her kind of going from idealistic to more practical and honest and really rooting it in reality, because it can just be such a broader just question. And so I think along those lines, going along those lines of like, how will we actually get there? Following through with that, like, what is the practical application of this? Alicia talked a lot about Black community organizing, specifically building coalitions across difference and what those different entry points to power look like. How can higher education leaders apply those lessons of organizing and mobilizing communities to reform and transform higher education?
I do believe that I think that higher education leaders can apply these lessons, especially what we learned about in Dr. Garza's keynote, in order to transform higher education. She talked about at the heart of it all is dignity and survival. And so it can be about the freedom dreams that many are afraid to say out loud. She talked a lot about freedom dreams. We know that there are things in this country that are in place to make certain communities fail, but that is the entry point to power. And as Garza says in her message to us a couple of months ago, even though this may seem daunting, freedom is our birthright, right? And so higher education leaders can learn that they should not be afraid to pursue the power, and that if they want to be powerful, understand that there's this global impact that shapes people's lives every day. In addition, it's important that we don't confuse power for empowerment, because they are two different things. And as power is about who gets what, when, and why. Empowerment can be about building institutions that can communicate your change and increase your value by being innovative, by focusing on something that's smaller, but adding to something that could be much bigger. So knowing that power is a birthright and lifting up in ways that we know our Black voters have reimagined America. When just the last election, we know that Black voters were critical in changing the power in the White House and committed to those freedom dreams that she talked about, and we're determined to kind of use every tool possible to get there. So those are kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, when I reflected on the conversation, I loved how Alicia kind of started off by saying kind of the mission of the Black Lives Matter movement. And she was saying that she wants Black communities deserve to be powerful in all areas of their life, their lives. And I also believe that, education, higher education can be a path to liberation. And I think that when you frame this conversation, and I know her conversation was centered on her work with, the Black Lives Matters movement, but, we are thinking about Black students, but also a number of minoritized students in all of our work, Indigenous students, Latino and Latina students, poor students. But we know that race, is kind of an underlying issue in all of these inequities. And so when I think about how she talked about organizing and mobilizing, I think that there are a couple of things that are absolutely key. I think first, we do have to recognize that the problems that that exist, they're socially constructed. You know what I'm saying? They are part of the system. And so the fact that she touched on, a lot of our work tends to focus on, what's the practice? What are the ideas? And it's like we need another. She kind of jokingly talked about, do we really need another logic model? And I laughed at that because it's like we're always talking about we need a white paper, we need a logic model, we need someone to talk about this. And I'm always thinking, what is it that we actually do? What will actually transform this system? And for me, it's like where does the power lie in that process? So it's about the things that truly create substantive change. It's the policy environment. You know what I'm saying? It's the advocacy. It's the building a movement work. And then it's also the practice. And all those things have to be aligned. And you can't kind of give up one for the other because they all have to work in concert.
Yeah, no, I also picked up on that point where she was kind of like, throw away the logic models. Like people are in different stages of understanding what even the problem is. And so having all this language can be very just even deterring for people to even engage in that conversation. And so I definitely heard that as well. I think in thinking about just this broader question about how do we transform higher education, how can we bring funders and philanthropists along for this ride? Alicia calls on funders to be this, she uses this phrase, the wind beneath our wings. So how can we call on funders to be this wind beneath our wings? In higher education, how can higher education funders be the wind beneath our wings?
I think that they can be the wind beneath our wings by connecting across differences and adopting a different worldview that is different than their own, right? Trying to adopt different approaches for how they may create change, as well as differences of opinion in how they might go about getting something done. So we heard a lot of Garza's talk, and she talked a little bit about building across differences to create coalitions and alliances that are just not predictable. So we know that doing this will send a powerful message about what you're serious about, how you're creating change, and how you're agreeing to do things that can be accomplished for the common good of the cause, regardless if you agree with someone or not. What are you guys working towards? And so that really resonated for me on how you can create change. I think that funders can, really think about how they're coming to the table, how they're respecting what we all bring to the table, how we're organizing around what we really care deeply about and what's at stake here. So it's really about wanting to see that brass tacks. And she talked a lot about the dignity and the survival around being able to thrive. And so I think that higher education funders, if they're going to be the wind beneath our wings, I think it's about allowing communities who historically do not have the power to be in positions of power, right? And to reconstitute what that power is and open more channels to these communities to be in power. So bringing Black and Brown families who've had little influence but bringing them close to that decision-making point and having honest conversations about how this can be accomplished. I think that higher education funders, if they could, and there was a lot of this talk in Garza's talk, but if higher education funders can stop controlling the process of experimentation and really thinking about how their grantees are implementing and focusing on grantees' strengths, they're really the people who are going to fund our innovation. So they can continue providing that funding and allowing the grantees to really put forth what the positive change is, because we know our swim lane. So if they just don't interfere with what that swim lane is and allow us to really work toward that common good, then I think that it will be a significant change if they can really let the grantees who know the landscape, who know the inspiration, that they can really activate that change that we want to see in higher education.
Yeah, I too appreciated that kind of wind beneath our wings kind of approach. I think that as an organization, Complete College America is a woman-led, a minority-led organization. And we spend, to kind of put this in very practical terms, we spend a lot of time on the phone with individuals asking questions about what does this mean for Black and Brown communities? What should this policy look like? What does this look like in practice? And we spend a lot of time saying, you may want to think about this. You may want to approach this a little differently before you show up at an HBCU or at a Hispanic serving institution. And I think that, being able to focus on the support of leaders and organizations who do the work, I think is absolutely critical. I think making investments in organizations that have, typically are sometimes the brain trust of ideas, but never necessarily the recipients of direct support that allows them to build sustainability and capacity to do the work for that particular community that they're seeking to serve is key. I think that a part of it is also, investing in leadership and the cultivation of leaders who represent those institutions and those students that we know have been left behind. And that requires a level of trust. You have to trust those mission-centric leaders and organizations to do the work and kind of get out of their way. I know there's over the past, decade or so, there's been this transition away from general operating support to specific program-based support. And I think that being able to provide that level of flexibility gives us a lot more room to do those things that I think are going to be key in moving this movement forward.
Thank you both. And I think I did want to ask a bit of a follow-up question, and you both kind of touched on this, but calling this out specifically, like what changes will funders in higher ed philanthropy need to make to center and really amplify practitioners of color, do you all think?
I would say that the changes that higher ed philanthropy and funders need to make to center around community and leaders of color is to allow them with a balanced seat at the table. I would say that allowing them with an entry point to be successful. And I know that when we were at the post-secondary convening, I was honored to do the closing remarks. And I said that it was important to make equity explicit in the design of services and delivered to institutions, and being intentional is very much needed, right? I also encouraged our higher ed philanthropy and funders to be more intentional as they position people of color within our very own ecosystem as the experts related to equity, and really thinking about how the work that we're doing, because many of the Black and Brown faces that are at the table, we can share our lived experiences. So we really must, the funders really must allow these voices of lived experiences to be told. It's kind of this thing, if you start with the premise that people who are routinely oppressed, that you can then learn from those communities. You can be better advocates, and you can improve the quality of higher education for those oppressed communities.
Yeah, I think what the funding community, the philanthropic community has to kind of begin with is just some of their own internal work and recognize that, many of the practices have been inequitable. And, but once you get to that point, because once you, pull the curtain back, you'll realize that there are some issues. The next step is, what are you going to do about it? And I think that, if we're talking about systemic change, and I think, Alicia, Garza really kind of focused on, you've got to move policy. You've got to be in the streets. You've got to have a movement. But in this moment, you've also got to be able to change the systems that exist. And there's a recognition that state policy leaders, federal policy leaders oftentimes have a very limited understanding of higher education broadly, and definitely not the inequities. So you have to really create equity-minded and equity-centered policy and practice that can't be an afterthought in the process. I mean, it has to be a plan, not for this moment, which means a series of investments over the next year. It has to be a long-term plan for sustainability, and you have to have an organizer's mindset where you are accessing trusted connections and the larger networks that have already been invested in. You want to be able to put that information and to use the power of the purse string to say, this is something that's critical and this is how we're going to use our dollars. I'll finally add that I think that we can't put all of those things in context without recognizing that cultural credibility is required to achieve the change for our most vulnerable and underrepresented institutions. And even people sometimes that look like the communities may not necessarily have that same level of understanding of that particular unique population. And so, culture is related to policy, and you want people who show up who already have trust and credibility in those communities. That's going to make the work a lot easier.
Yeah. And I think even Alicia called to that about, like, at the heart of it, it's culture. It's not necessarily like all these, it's culture at the heart of it. And that's where I think she rooted those words of like dignity related to culture. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to give you all a moment or both an opportunity to share any final reflections or key takeaways just from this conversation from Alicia's keynote about the work that you all, for you, and the work that you all do at ASCU and CCA.
I was struck by her entire talk. I will say that. I was definitely struck by her comments around the freedom dreams and that nobody gets left behind. And we can live our freedom dreams during the day and night. I thought that was just profound. I also thought it was profound when she touched on this idea of building our movement and creating change that we want to see, and that knowing that hashtags do not start movements, but people do. And so changing the conditions for students and families means bringing them closer to the levers of decision making, which then means bringing them closer to power. And I would say that, at ASCU, we are serving students who are historically underrepresented. And so our institutions are serving these students and these families. And we are really, really working to deliver what America's promise looks like. And as Dhanfu alluded earlier, we want to make sure that we're putting the people in place to have that credibility and who have that credibility. And so that's what we're striving to do every day at ASCU.
Yeah, I think that there's a contextual piece to this work, and it's not enough to just know stuff, and just to read about stuff and to listen in on amazing speeches. But I think that can be a centering point, but you have to tap into that emotional feeling that's associated with action, and the only way that happens is by making sure those people that are part of the movement are people who've been committed to that work, and I think that, as a Black man who, has Black children, I think about this every single day as I look at their faces, and I want to make sure that the environment that I create and that I have the ability to affect and transform doesn't just affect my children, but impacts all of those children, all those communities who don't have that same level of advocacy in their, in their lives, and individuals who can open doors. And I think that if we are trying to do equity first work around student success and higher education transformation, we can't do that with old tools. We have to think about new, innovative ways. And I think the true innovation are not the ideas. The ideas have existed for years, for decades. Many of the institutions we talk about, their missions are centered around doing this work for the most minoritized students. But we have to make sure that that work gets scaled, that work gets moved to a level that it impacts more students than less.
Well, thank you both, Jackie and Dhanfu, for your time today and sharing your insights. You both shared a beautiful and powerful vision for the future of our work and the ways in which we can improve higher education for minoritized students. And we also reflected on how we cannot do this alone. We need our philanthropists and funders to be at our side and continuing to center the voices of Black and Brown leaders. So to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please visit the Catalyst Ed site and follow us on social media to keep up with our post-secondary work. And